Hello everyone. Let's start with the next session of 5 operations in Python with creating and deleting a folder and the whereabouts and how to handle the config and the log files. As we had discussed in the last session of creating a file and deleting a file, we'll also look into how to create a folder and deletion of a folder in this session. Now we need to, again, if we are working on Colab, we need to collaborate, we need to import our drive on Colab to access the files which are there on our drive. So this is where we got to authenticate it completely and then start with the execution. Moving on, what all is needed is OS module is required to be imported and pathlib module is what is to be imported altogether. Now once create the directory to in the file, or let's say we want to actually create a directory called fy class. So how to do it is path is equal to pathlib.path. Now this is what pathlib import file or module does, is it actually connects us to a specific path in the directory. Here I have not mentioned any particular path, and so in my complete directory I will be able to see my fy class. Now I try it to open or make the directory by os.mkdir within the path. If this is not executed, then it will definitely show me the error. So I just executed it now, and I can see here that a folder of my class, the same name which I had mentioned, is already created. Moving on to how to remove that particular directory from the drive. So let's say the same import files, that is, I need to import OS as well as the pathlib, mention the complete path over here, and for removing the directory I use os.rmdir. Okay, and with that I need to mention the path. Now this is nothing but the file object over here. So this will remove the dir, that is the directory, completely, and will definitely show me how the file has been removed. Now here it shows me that fy class removed successfully, but still you can see it over here. So for that you need to refresh it first, and you will see that the contents are been removed. The folder itself is gone. Now moving on to the config files. Basically, the config obj is a simple but powerful config file reader and writer and INI file rounder tripper. Its main feature is that it is a very easy to use with a straightforward programmer's interface and a simple syntax for config files. It has lots of other features though, that is nested sections, that is subsections to any level, list values, multiple line values, string interpolations. When writing out config files, that is config objs, perceives all comments and the order of members and sections. Many useful methods and options for working with config files are available, like the reload method. Full Unicode support is there with the config files, integrated with a powerful validation system which includes automatic type conversions and checkings, repeated sections, and allowing default values. The config files that config obj will read and write are based on the INI format. This means that it will read and write files created for config parser. Keywords and values are separated by an equal to sign, and section marker are between square brackets. Keywords, values, and section names can be surrounded by single or double quotes. Indentation is not significant but can be preserved. That is a very important point. Subsections are indicated by repeating the square brackets in the section marker. You nest levels by using more brackets. You can have list values by separating items with a comma, and values spanning multiple lines by using triple quotes or single or double quotes. The very normal way of reading a config file is from config parser, import config parser. Now remember to actually use C capitals over here, otherwise it may give you errors. Reading config.in file, how to read it is config underscore object, right, is equal to config parser. Config underscore object dot read with config dot ini. So this is how we can read the config ini, where I have to actually access the config parser and then read the config file. Now let's assume that I want to get some password which is already there in my config file. So user info is equal to, which I had already defined with a config object called user info. From that, print password is in the format of user password. So if this is what I want to access, this is how I want to access the password which is already written in my config files. We will see the examples too. You can also pass the config file in as a list of lines or a string IO instance, so it does not matter where your config data comes from. You can then access members of your config file as a directory. Subsections will also be dictionaries. So writing a config file, how do I write it down completely? Let's say from config parser, which I want to import the config parser over here, and with that I want to initialize. I get an object in config parser from the config parser. Now let's assume that you have two sections in the config file. Let me call it as the user info and the server configuration or config. So this config object in the square brackets, I write it down as user info. And what all information do I have it? I got to mention it with equal to and curly braces. Within the curly braces, I actually write it down as admin with the colon and then write it as Python for engineers or FY Python, easy to learn. These are my passwords. Now, if you see properly, I have actually defined it as a directory with key and values. Similarly, the second section of my config parser is config underscore object. What is it? It is the server config, where it has the host, the port, and the IP address. Write the above sections, all these sections, to a config.ini file, which will be called as a directory with open config.ini w as config. You can access the complete object in write mode. So here I have written an config.ini file within which we have mentioned a user info, the admin, the login ID and the password, and the subsection, the another section was survey config, which is host, the port and the IP address. This is all stored in an config.ini file. This was all created as in try Python. I had written the name for that particular Python program with an extension, and I had given all this, that is, which we had already observed, that is the user info as well as the server configuration. Now this is what was reflected, this is what we had written in config.ini. By executing this particular program, we had actually written down all the contents of user info as well as the server configuration in a config.ini file. Now let's say I want to change or update the configuration file. So now I have just updated the simple configuration file where the user information, I have accessed the user information. I want to change the password to be as my password. Previously it was easy to learn, but now I want to make it as new password. I write it down with open config.ini write mode as config into the object, like config object, write down this particular file. Okay, whatever is mentioned over here has to be written in the config.ini file. So if I run this particular file, my config.ini file contents will change, the password will change by default to now a new password. So this is how normally we change the passwords and all whenever a password request we are going to raise for. Moving on to log files. Logging is a means of tracking events that happens when small or some software runs. A software developer adds logging calls to their codes to indicate that certain events have occurred. The events also have an importance which the developer subscribe or describe to the event. The importance can also be called as the level or severity, as in to check whether there are errors in the file, how much critical it can be. The logging provides a set of convenience functions for simple logging usage. These are debug, info, warning, error, and critical. The logging functions are named after the level of severity or the levels of severity which are to be tracked on. The standard levels are their abilities or applicability for their severities. The default level is warning. It just gives you a simple warning, which means that only events of this level and above will